So the biggest mistake is thinking that things will take less time than they actually will take. So building in buffer time to your workshop is always a good idea.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Coach Tribe podcast. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Brittni, and we're going to talk about a topic that many of you actually asked us to talk about, which is workshops. How can you, as a consultant, coach, or creator, use workshops in order to grow your business and attract more leads, more clients? Brittni, a pleasure to have you here with us today. Hello, and how are you?
Thank you so much for having me, Maria. It's my pleasure to be on your podcast. Super excited to be here.
Can you tell us why should people stick around and listen to this episode? What will they get out of it?
So this episode, I think, is going to be really interesting if you want to build better relationships with your clients, if you want your clients to be a lot more on board with the kinds of coaching that you're providing them with, if you love like co-collaborating with your clients. And also it's a great way, like the things that we'll talk about today will also allow you to do some like lead generation as well. So I think it's going to be, honestly, I think everybody should use more workshops in their client work. So I think it's for all of you people.
Gotcha. Definitely, I am super interested, especially because the truth is, I actually don't know much about workshops. And one thing I want to ask you first is, can you tell us what's the difference between workshops and webinars? Just to have that clear, because I know sometimes there's a bit of misconception there.
That's true. That does happen a lot, that people ask, for a webinar, but they really want a workshop or vice versa. So the difference really is that in a webinar, usually you're delivering information and there isn't a lot of development happening within the webinar. So usually in a workshop, you're actually working with whoever's in your workshop on creating something together. So whether that's like a strategy or a plan or, coming up with new ideas, you're actually working together towards a common goal. So a webinar is, I think, usually more informative, whereas a workshop is more like getting into the nitty gritty and really getting your hands dirty.
Gotcha. So it's also about that practical side where you actually have them do tasks or like you walk through the
100%.
process with them. Gotcha.
Exactly. So you're doing different exercises, you have sort of a starting point and then you have a desired end point. And as the workshop facilitator, you're guiding your participants through very specific exercises to get them to their goal.
Love that. Yep, I like something that is practical in the end because the truth is, yes, webinars are great and I actually love them. I do webinars. I am part of many webinars, but for a workshop, that having that practical part and walking away with something tangible at the end of it, I guess that's where the value really is. Now,
Exactly.
question, is workshop something we can do virtual as well? Like, because I know a lot of workshops are happening face to face and real life, but can workshops be virtual as well?
Absolutely. I would say maybe not 50. I mean, during COVID, obviously, I was running workshops 100% remotely, but I would say still, I managed to do probably like 40 or 50% of my workshops remotely because people are no longer going to the office every day. We have people working from like global teams where everybody's sort of all over the world. So it's really important to be able to still do workshops, even if we can't be in the same room together. And there's tons of tools that will help you achieve that. So there's like online whiteboards where you can actually still all be like participating on a whiteboard together with post-it notes and you can draw and all this stuff. Super cool, actually, all the tools available. So absolutely. And honestly, sometimes remote workshops I don't want to say I love being in the room with my workshop participants. It's my favorite, but sometimes remote workshops can be just as effective, if not maybe even more effective, depending on what you're looking for.
Gotcha. Okay, that's a relief. There you have it for whoever is listening. there's no excuse. You can do it virtual too. So no excuses there. Okay, cool. Now, just before we get into the nitty-gritty of how to, create these workshops, structure them, and measure success, I want to ask you, where do these workshops fit in the, let's say, funnel? Like, why should coaches, consultants consider using workshops, and where is the, let's say, perfect place to integrate them? When is this something they should consider?
Totally. So I am a workshop designer, facilitator, and I host events and things. So now that's 100% of what I do because I love it so much. Before that, I was working a lot in content, and I had like marketing, content marketing, social media, consulting, all this kind of world. So a lot of that, I was through a lot of my consulting in that field, I was using workshops. And what I found is that when you use a workshop, there's a couple of things that happen. First of all, everybody is aligned in a workshop. There's no room for confusion. It's very clear what we're doing together. So, you're co-creating. So at the end of the workshop, everybody's on the same page. And it's so nice when you're working with clients that everybody is completely aligned. Like, that's baseline what you want, right? Second thing that happens is that people, when they're actually tangibly working on something and not just giving you something to work on and then you present it back to your client, for instance, if you're actually working with them to create something, they are going to, it's kind of it's something called the IKEA effect, right? When you build something yourself, when you are a part of the process of making it, you like it more, you think it's better, more powerful, like your feedback will be much better about this item or this thing. So that's so cool when it comes to workshops, because your clients will have a better experience because you're actually creating with them. So when to use it in your process? I mean, I don't want to say you can use it all the time, but so first of all, definitely in a kickoff. Like, if you're kicking off with a new client, that is absolutely when you want to run a workshop. I also find it super effective to use maybe even before you kick off as a discovery call. So sometimes, depending on the kinds of coaching you're doing or consulting, you might need a lot of information from your client in order to onboard, right? It's like, okay, what is their business, or what are we working on here? What are the goals, right? So if you want to do sort of an onboarding discovery session, a workshop is so great for that. But for sure, the kickoff, because the kickoff is where everything kind of, you need that alignment, like I was talking about. You need to be completely on the same page, and that's going to be great there. Then usually when, what I would suggest is, as a coach or a consultant, you're going away with what you've learned from the kickoff. You have your goals that you need to achieve potentially. You go off and do some work. And then I love having a workshop as sort of your catch up. And sort of your kind of like, okay, we're halfway there, or okay, we need to have a little check-in, right? Having that as a workshop format where you come back together, and they know the format now because you kicked off with it. You come back together, you look at what's working, you look at what's not working, you come up with what your next steps are going to be together. Super powerful. And then to close out, if you, I don't know, it depends how you're working with your clients, but if you have a session where it's like, okay, this is sort of like after the 6 weeks, it's our last session, for instance. Okay, here's what we're going to do in our workshop. We're going to summarize our key learnings together. We're going to figure out what you're going to do next moving forward, create some plans, whatever that might be. So I think using them as like almost like bookends and bookmarkers, right, that's kind of, for me, has been the best way to use workshops.
The Coach Tribe podcast is powered by Pensight. I want to take this opportunity to tell you more about Pensight and how much value it can provide you and your coaching business.
Pensight is an all-in-one platform for coaches and educators that enables you to quickly and easily build a highly credible page and sell your knowledge with one-to-one sessions, group coaching, courses, Q&As, digital products, and bundles. Payments, scheduling, video calling, client communications, and everything else is taken care of.
All it takes is 5 minutes to set up, and it's free. It's the smartest way to kickstart your coaching business. Sign up to Pensight today at pensight.com.
just because from what you're saying, it seems like you see workshops as a component of the program rather than a way to get clients to your program. So
Mm.
how does that work? Because I also know there are some coaches out there who use workshops maybe as a way to get those clients to their programs. Can you tell us a bit about this difference and how do you see it and how do you think it works best from your experience?
Yeah, so as a lead generator, I think a workshop can be really great. What you want to do, like what I personally would do and have done, is I'll run a very short free workshop. Maybe it's an hour. So it's something like a webinar, but the difference is you're doing something together. So you're really providing value. They need to leave your session with something, right? So it's not just information. They need to leave with something like a short plan or an idea for their first step into, like, I'm just using social media because that's a background of mine, but like maybe they have a plan for their first LinkedIn post, or maybe they, there's some kind of tangible outcome that they have. And what I would do is I would advertise my free webinar, make it jam packed with value. So I would do, like, if it's an hour, I would do maybe 20 minutes up front of information, introducing the topic, giving them some really great insights. Then I would jump into the workshop portion, do that for, like, let's say 30 minutes. So you have a 30-minute workshop where you have maybe 2 or 3 exercises you're going through together. You're explaining what you're going to do. Okay, we're going to first brainstorm a few ideas for what your first LinkedIn post is going to be, depending on the industry you're in, whatever. Okay, next we're going to talk about what the hook of your LinkedIn post is going to be. What's that first line going to be? We're going to workshop that together. Okay. And then the last thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you a nice templatized, format for how you're actually going to structure and write your first LinkedIn post. Okay, awesome. Last thing is you're going to put a photo in it or whatever, right? So you have this very, very specific series of events that happens. Then at the end, you have a little bit of time for Q&A. Also, of course, maybe you say, if you really liked this webinar, I actually also provide coaching around LinkedIn and how to use it properly. And, you can hire me for that. Or I have another bigger half-day workshop where we're going to actually create a LinkedIn strategy for you, and you can sign up for that here, right? So for me, it's like always providing that value up front, giving them something. And, it's okay to give some things away for free as long as it's not, you're not spending too much of your time or too much of your value without getting anything in return. But as a lead generator, I mean, workshops are like, they're brilliant.
Gotcha. And the cool thing is that you've already kind of presented the structure of a workshop. So you said, at least for this lead gen ones, you said 20 minutes webinar informative style, 30 minutes workshop, then Q&A, then call to action. Does the structure look different for the workshops happening on a program? So they're already your client and you do workshops to work with them on different teams. Is the structure similar? Or like what changes?
What changes is that they've already hired me, so I don't need to prove myself by delivering a bunch of information up front, right? So I'm not trying to sell my services to them because they've already purchased. So what I want to do is provide them with as much value in terms of like solutions for them. I want to help them as much as possible. So the difference is probably that when I'm working with a workshop client, I'm trying to get as much information from them in order to best build the perfect workshop, so that we can get from like where they currently are to where they want to be. So for me, like when I'm running workshops, a lot, like, they differ a lot. Sometimes it's like a team building workshop where the goal is actually just to have some fun together as a team. Sometimes I'm running a workshop that's like, okay, we have an internal problem at our company. For instance, like communication is an issue between teams. Okay, so then the workshop is, how can we better improve communication between all of our teams, right? So then we would go through a series of events where we come up with ideas and we vote on them, and then we kind of refine our ideas, and then we move forward with one idea to put into place. So it just sort of like, it really depends. I mean, also then like other workshops are a lot more business focused, where it's like, okay, we have this big business challenge. How do we communicate about this new product that we're launching? We're going to be putting a lot of money into a huge TV or marketing campaign, we need to know how we're going to communicate it. So it's like, okay, well, we start with what we know about our consumers, what we know about our product, and we get some ideas going. Then we test our ideas, and then we kind of refine our ideas and move forward. So it's like workshops are so cool because they're so versatile and you can use them in almost any scenario, and it gets people involved. So, I mean, yeah, I don't even remember what your question was, Maria. I just went on a total tangent about workshops. I can't remember what you even asked me, but I feel like maybe I somewhat answered the question.
You did, yes. Now, I got you. And to be even more specific, I want to ask you, let's imagine I'm a coach and I want to create my first workshop. We can decide whether it's a lead gen workshop or already within the program to help them get from A to B. What are the things that I need to know? How do I design my first workshops? Like, how do I even get into it? How do I structure it? Like, what's the timeline for it?
Oof, this is a big question. Okay, so the first thing that you need is to be very, very clear with your client about what the expectations are. So what do they want to achieve with this workshop? That is the key question. And ask several times, like get down to exactly what they want to achieve. Because usually when you ask a client, like, okay, what are you hoping to achieve? It's all very lofty goals, right? It's all like, oh, well, we just want to do this or we want to do. And it's like, okay, no, but like tangibly out of our session, what would you like to leave with, right? And once I say the word tangible, usually I get a really specific response. They're like, oh, well, we want a script for our new TV ad, or we want, an idea that we can implement in our company for this problem, right? I'm like, oh, okay, great. And then your next question is, where are we at right now? Like, what is the current state of affairs? And then they'll say, well, we've tried a few things, or we have a couple of this and that. Or they'll be like, we've got nothing, and then you're like, okay. So once you know where you're starting from and then where you plan to go, then you can better know how long your workshop needs to be, who you need at that workshop, all of those things. So that would be the starting point, okay? Then you're going to plan your agenda, right? So depending on how much time you have with the team or with the person, you're going to plan an agenda accordingly. And one of my biggest pieces of advice would be to make sure you're being honest with yourself and with the client about how much you can actually achieve in a certain amount of time, because there's no way you can create like a full-blown strategy for this person's, marketing of their business within an hour or 2 hours, right? So be realistic, and people really appreciate that when you're working with them, when you're honest and realistic upfront with the expectation, right? So once you know where you are and where you need to go, then this is the fun part. It comes into designing what exactly is going to happen at your workshop. So you know where you're starting, your starting point is. Then you need to think about who's in the room with you. And what is their, one of my favorite questions to ask the client is tell me about the team. Like, what is their vibe? Are they super excited about this challenge? Are they actually a little bit frustrated by this challenge? You want to know what the level is, because then you know the kinds of activities that will work better with the team or with the person, right? So once you know that, you can start doing some research into different activities, different things. If I were creating a workshop, let's just use that LinkedIn example because it's just so simple and easy to understand. So it's like if I were thinking about LinkedIn and I had a group of people who'd never even never posted on LinkedIn ever, I would create a different workshop than one if people were like, yeah, I post from time to time, but it's just not nothing's catching, right? It would be a completely different workshop. So let's say they've never posted on LinkedIn before. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to get them to explore a bit. So the best way I can describe, the easiest way, let's say, a workshop format is you can think about it as going wide, so casting a really wide net, and then focusing, and then maybe casting a wide net again, and then refocusing. So it's kind of like that. That's a really nice flow. So you always start by casting a wide net. So I might say, hey, everybody, maybe before the workshop, or maybe it's in the workshop, I say, I want you to look at LinkedIn. I want you to browse around and get inspired and come back to me with 3 people who you think are doing a really great job on LinkedIn, or 3 posts that you really like even. And then we have some inspiration. So we're starting with some ideas and it's like, okay, cool. And then let's maybe talk about why we like those ideas, And so that would maybe be how I would start a workshop with somebody who's never really spent a lot of time on LinkedIn. If they have been posting and they've been struggling, then I would start it differently. I would say, okay, let's first look at what's been working for you and what's not been working for you. So we kind of like go wide on, it's like, okay, what's been working, what's not been working. Okay, cool. And then we kind of zero in. So it's like, well, what's working? So how can we use what's working and expand on that? So the exercises really just depend on like where you're coming from, but a lot of them involve like inspiration, thinking, narrowing things down, coming up with lots of ideas, and then voting up some ideas that are more interesting than others. I really like to, like when I'm designing a workshop, I really like to give people like a lot of freedom to explore. So not adding too much pressure to the situation. So it's like, there's no bad ideas. Let's go wild. Just like write it down as many ideas as you can think of. And then you narrow in, then you like get rid of the bad ideas and focus on the good ones that have popped up. So, I mean, it's hard to really walk through the full design of a workshop, but I think that gives you sort of a good idea of how to at least kick off a workshop and in different ways.
I love that, especially with the idea of know where they're at, but also where they want to get. I think that that's a very easy way to help you structure a workshop. Now, because we already know a bit about structuring a workshop, I want to ask you, what are some ways we can use to ensure that our workshop is engaging and interactive? Like, what can we do about that?
It's so important to think about. I think a lot of people focus so much on the exercises and making sure everything's perfect that they forget actually a really important part of a workshop is to motivate everybody, have a bit of fun together, kind of reinvigorate and get some energy back into the topic or the project or the challenge that you're working on. So biggest thing is always starting out very, very specifically. So the way you kick off a workshop is like the most important. So before you get into any of the activities, you have to, and this is like very kind of standard advice that's so important, to have an icebreaker. So have an icebreaker with everybody. My favorite icebreakers are super simple. I just ask everybody a question. And usually the question that I ask is very specific about the challenge that we're dealing with. Like, for instance, I was doing a week-long workshop that was all about, it was like a branding and marketing challenge. And so I asked everybody, if your personal brand were a brand that exists, if you could compare yourself to one brand that's out there, which one would it be? So we had people saying, Starbucks, and people saying Nike, and people saying, all these kind of interesting responses. And it's like, why, right? So everybody kind of gets to know each other a little bit. And the reason why breaking the ice is so important is that it allows people to relax a little bit and settle in. And that's when you're going to get the best ideas, the best input from them, when they're not nervous to speak because they haven't spoken yet, So it's always the first thing you say in a meeting or a workshop is always the scariest. So get that out of the way and just let everybody loosen up a bit. So that's for sure the first thing I do in a workshop that creates a bit of that fun energy. Then you really want to make sure that you set expectations properly with everyone. And I know that doesn't sound very like exciting and motivating and energizing, but the thing about it is there's nothing more demotivating than you going into a workshop thinking something was going to happen, and then you see that actually something completely different is actually happening in this workshop. It's super upsetting for the person because they've taken time out of their schedule to be there with you. So make sure that expectations are set, which means maybe you ask everybody what they're expecting to get out of today or the week, and then you clarify it with them. That's the biggest thing, is being like, oh, actually, we're not going to cover that you just mentioned, but we will cover this, right? So then everybody's aligned on what we're actually doing here together. And what that does is it creates trust, right? And a bit of credibility for you as the facilitator. And people are just much more excited to work with you because they're like, oh, cool. Okay, this is what we're going to do together. So that's super important. Setting a few rules and boundaries is also really important. And I'm not just saying that because I live in Germany and rules are very important here. But it's really important to have a few specific, like, there's always going to be potentially like potential for someone to become a bit of a troublemaker or a bit difficult in a session, especially if you're doing obviously a bigger group session. So just setting some rules where it's like, okay, we only have this amount of time together. So, I really want to make sure that when I'm explaining the exercises that we're all paying attention. If you have please put your phone away. If you're, expecting an email, we are going to have breaks here and here and here. So you can check your emails then, whatever the rules need to be, make sure they're really clear at the beginning. And then regular breaks, super important. Toss in another random silly energizer right after lunch if you're having a full day session. That's so important. It's just, yeah, it needs to be. And also when it comes to just designing your workshop, thinking about the flow of exercises. So some exercises are maybe more verbal, where people are kind of talking, and some exercises then need to be quieter. You need to have a nice balance and a flow that works. So not all the exercises can be everybody just like brainstorming openly. It's exhausting. And also, you need to think about the fact that you probably have in your group some extroverts, some introverts. Make sure that you're accommodating your workshop so that everybody's comfortable and able to participate. So there's this book and it's called The Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath. Excellent book. If you actually, as a coach, as a consultant, as anybody who works with clients, you should read this book. It's excellent. And basically what they talk about is something like a lot of things, but they talk about something called peak moments. And this is kind of crazy, but basically the idea is if you create like yourself, you construct peak moments throughout your workshop or your, experience or your event. Peak moments where people are having like a really good time or something surprised them, something like this, right? People will remember your workshop as being a lot better than maybe it actually was. And I know that sounds silly, but it's like you can craft these moments that give people that high. Whereas, if you kind of just, if you never did that, if you had the same workshop but didn't create these nice peaks, people would remember your workshop as not as good. Even though maybe you just did something silly where you got them out of their chair and moving around, and it had nothing to do with the outcome of the workshop. So thinking about ways that you can craft these peak moments and create those memorable moments in your workshops and events is so, so important.
I love that. I know you've been talking a bit in the last few minutes, but I loved every part from the icebreaker to this peak moments. And can I actually ask you, can you give us an example or two of some of these peak moments? Like you just mentioned to stand up and like, just give us two examples of peak moments.
Totally. Okay. So I'll give you examples of ones that I've done. So yeah. Okay. So one of the things that if I'm running a week-long workshop, which is a super long workshop, usually at the end of day one, which is a very exhausting day because you're working in a bit of a different way and everything's brand new. So end of day one's always really exhausting in a week-long workshop. I'll give everybody in the team, actually, usually I have one right here. Usually I give them a little book like this. So this is, it's called Steal Like an Artist. It's just an excellent little like book about creativity by Austin Kleon. And it's a cute little like off desk-sized book that you can just like pick up. It's very visual as well. And I'll give everybody at the end, I'll like wrap it in a bow and just be like, congratulations on finishing the first day of our workshop. It's a tough one. You really held out for it and you were here and you participated. And I just appreciate that so much. And everybody, when they're like exhausted and about to go home, they're kind of like, oh, that's so cool. They were completely not expecting that. It's just a really silly, it's like, $8 or $9 a book. It's nothing crazy that's going to break the bank, but it creates this really nice moment that they're going to remember, right? Then, and of course, maybe this sits on their desk and every time they look at it, they think of you. Cool, right? Another thing that I love to do is, I can give you more examples, but in a bigger session, I mean, not necessarily, but if there's more than like, maybe there's like 8 people in your session, at the end of the session, if it's one day, let's say, if it's less time, then it might be a bit weird. But if it's a one-day session, at the end of the session, I like to turn on some like ridiculous music like something like We Are the Champions or something like really ridiculous, and get everybody to like come up one by one and give me like a rocking high five while everybody else in the room is like cheering. And I know it sounds crazy. It sounds a little weird. Like, how could I get everybody to do that? But it's so funny because if you're able to get past the awkwardness of telling everybody what you're about to do, people love it. Like, people just, they dive right in. They've worked all day, they know each other well now because they've spent the whole day together, and they're just like ready for like breaking loose and being a bit silly. The other thing you can do, which is super simple, is like just plan a little after workshop happy hour, whatever. Like, it can be something so small, but it's just so, it really is what makes the difference.
Gotcha. I love them, and I also love the idea of incorporating fun in what you do. Yes, we work. Yes, we are all focused, but let's not forget that these moments, as you were saying, really can make a difference. And like, in the end of the day, we're all humans, and it's good to get those energy levels up. So I loved it.
100.
Now we are almost to the end of this episode, but I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned 1 to 2 hour workshops, you mentioned a full day workshop, and you mentioned a full week workshop session in terms of length. I mean, can you tell us more about this? Like, what is the most common time for a workshop? What's like how, yeah, like just this about like the length of the workshop. What should we know about that?
So the length obviously really depends on your challenge and what you're hoping to achieve and how many inputs you need, right? So like, I would never do a week-long workshop with like 1 or 2 people. That would be really way too long. It doesn't really make sense. I think that if you have a big challenge that needs a lot of hands on deck. So it's like, a lot of times I go into companies that have a really big challenge. It's a bit, risky, so they're going to invest a lot in the challenge. And what they want to learn a lot about the challenge. They want to come up with an idea to tackle the challenge. They want to test that idea to make sure it's the right way to move forward. And so all of that takes about a week. Like, that's when I say week-long workshop, usually I'm talking about a big business challenge. We have 8 to 10 people in the room, and we are going from having like a big challenge to a solution that's been tested with their consumer. So that's kind of like the week-long format. Otherwise, I think that something around 3 to 4 hours is a really good amount of time for a workshop if you're in a small group. So if you're doing like, let's say your kickoff workshop for your client, I would say I wouldn't push it more than 4 hours. You shouldn't need more than that time. And that's enough. It's not long enough that people will get like really exhausted. I mean, they'll still be tired because working in workshop format is new for a lot of people and it is quite strenuous. But it's really, 3 to 4 hours, you have time for like one break in there. You can separate it into 2 blocks where the first block is you're exploring, right? And then maybe exploring your challenge and then narrowing down what the focus is for the challenge. And then your second block after your break would be solutions. So how are we going to solve that challenge, or what are we going to do? What's our plan, right? So I think that's a really nice sort of structure. And 3 to 4 hours is kind of a perfect, like, tie it on a bow, perfect little workshop. Anything like 1 to 2 days, sometimes you need to do like lots of idea building and maybe iterating your ideas. That can maybe take a couple of days. Yeah, I mean, the shorter, like, you never want to try to make your workshop longer. Like, you always want to deliver the shortest version of it, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And when you say 1 2 days workshops, is it like a full day workshop or like 4 hours every day?
Good question. So usually what I would do is, depending where I am in the world, because everybody starts work at a different time. When I'm in Berlin, I usually start workshops around 10 a.m. and I wrap them at about 4 p.m. with an hour for lunch. And then of course some breaks. So you're kind of like, it's about, well, what is that? 6 hours? Yeah. So that's 6 hours, but with an hour break. When I'm other places in the world, it might be like 9 to 4 kind of vibe.
Gotcha. Now, after all of these goodies and so much information. Super useful, honestly. I cannot wait to re-listen to this episode. How do we
Cool.
measure the success of the workshop?
Mm, excellent question. So a workshop is never complete within the workshop, if that makes sense. So like when you finish your workshop, the last thing you do has to be, and you cannot not do this, next steps. What are the next steps? Because the work never ends in the workshop, because you can't do everything in the workshop, right? You can create your plan or your strategy or whatever, but at the end of the workshop, we need to know, okay, what's happening next? And one of my favorite ways and easiest ways to do this is to just take a few minutes at the end of your workshop to craft the next 3 to 5 steps of what's happening. So it's like, let's say you've created a strategy. So what's the next step? Okay, well, we're going to present this strategy to our boss or our manager, whatever, get feedback. We're going to iterate on the strategy. Then we're going to kick off our first week of the strategy on whatever date, right? So really concrete, like almost stupidly concrete next step plan. Who's in charge of each step? All those things are so important, because that is the big thing that a lot of people do, is they do this like ideation workshop and they come up with all these cool ideas, and at the end they're like, thanks guys, we have so many ideas, see you later. And then nothing happens with the ideas, right? They just like get lost, or they get put in someone's drawer and never seen again. So important that you create like, okay, let's choose one idea, and then how are we going to make this idea happen? How are we going to maybe test this idea really quickly, right? So it's all about the action after the workshop. And then, testing whether or not your workshop is successful, I think really is just like, are we using what we've created in our workshop? Have the steps happened? Have they been completed? Is really the big one. Of course, unless you're running a workshop on something super specific, you can literally test whether or not that, worked. But otherwise, it's like, okay, what's happened since the workshop? That's how we can test whether it was successful or not.
Got it. I'm super happy I asked that question, because I feel like this next steps was something super important to know. Now, I know it was the last question. I said it's the last question, but I have the real last question, which
Okay.
is, what are, we talked and touched on different points about creating, structuring a workshop, but what is something that we maybe haven't mentioned and people should know? Like, if there's anything that comes to your mind that we should know about workshops, or maybe mistakes to avoid, anything that we should know and that hasn't been mentioned.
So the biggest mistake, for sure, is thinking that things will take less time than they actually will take. So building in buffer time to your workshop is always a good idea. Even if you're like looking at your workshop and you're like, well, that like 15 minutes for that seems like, well, we could do that in 3 minutes. There will always be people asking extra questions. Someone didn't understand, oh, you're doing remotely and someone like dropped off in the middle of it and had to come back. There's always going to be something that's going to just cost you a little bit more time than you anticipated. So always budget for more time than you think you need. And hey, like if you finish early, then you finish early. What I love to do is have like a little sort of like activity at the end that is just, if I have time, I'll do it as like a fun send off. If I don't have like, the ending activity, I'll always do something as a send off, but depending on how much time I have, I choose which activity to do. So that's a hot tip, definitely, is to just plan for everything to take a really long time, because it does.
Super, super useful. I haven't even thought about that. See, that's why I'm so happy you're here with us. Now, Brittni, this has been so good and so, so useful. I want to ask you, like, where can people find you, and why should they consider reaching out to you? How can you help them? Can you tell us more?
Yeah. Absolutely. So I am active on Instagram and LinkedIn and TikTok. I'm like throwing things out into the abyss on TikTok, okay? Because why not? So yeah, LinkedIn, I'm super active, and Instagram is probably the best place because it's like the most personal. I really like Instagram. And that's just Brittni Bowering on all of the platforms. You can find me. And what you can reach out for me for, definitely, all I post is really like educational, valuable content around facilitation, building workshops, hosting things, anything around like presenting and sort of like being in front of people is what I love to talk about. So yeah, you can follow me there. In terms of how we can work together, I work mostly with companies, but I am planning to do some more public trainings around workshop development and facilitation soon. So you can kind of stay tuned for those.
So you heard her. Make sure you follow her. I'm also gonna drop a link in the description and the caption of the podcast episode. And honestly, I didn't know you were on TikTok. So guess what I'm gonna do after this? I'm gonna stalk you.
I mean,
there.
I have like no followers, Maria. It's embarrassing, but I'm just throwing things out there. Why
You know
not?
what? Whoever is on
It's all
TikTok,
good.
let's go and follow Brittni. I'm gonna do this too. So you're gonna have like one extra, or even two, because I have two accounts.
I'm
There you
honored.
go.
I'm honored.
But what can I say? Thank you so much. This has been so useful.
Awesome.
Thank you to the audience for sticking till the end. I bet this was worth it. And any last words?
No, just thanks so much. I think you're an excellent interviewer, by the way. I feel like you really got a lot out of me.
I did. I'm getting better. This is like squeezing my guests from like
Very
the
good.
best information
impressed.
for my listeners and my audience. To get
Honestly,
as much
really
as
good.
possible. Cool. Then thank you, Brittni. Thank you, dear listeners. And I guess see you all for the next episode of the Coach Tribe podcast. Have a good day. Ciao. Hope you enjoyed this episode.
We'll be releasing every Wednesday, so make sure to
Subscribe
and rate us 5 stars where you're listening to this show to give others a chance to discover it too.